in a way, music is, you say, a signpost, but in a way it's also kind of like a drug, a very powerful drug, a narcotic. For instance, if those of you who have been have had surgery, and they give you this very I guess I actually had surgery. I had a partial thyroidectomy, and they gave me fentanyl before then, and it puts you in another world. Even with N2O, if you go to the dentist and they give you N2O, it does something to you. As far as I'm concerned, when I've had that, well, what it has done is it enables me to look at death fearlessly. And this is, the assassins were, these were people who, there's when the Mongols invaded the Middle East, they conquered everything up to the Battle of Ain Jalut, where the Mamluks managed to throw them back.
Gesundheit.
Yeah. Well, wait a minute. So they were also resisted deeper in toward Central Asia by people who were called the assassins, and their leader was named Rukn ad-Din, and they lived in high fortresses, and the Mongols couldn't get to the fortresses, and they would send people out to kill the Mongol leaders. And before they sent them out, they would partake of hashish, so that they weren't afraid of death. And this happens a lot. In fact, unfortunately, when in October 7th, when Hamas came and slaughtered the Israelis, they were under the influence of Captagon, and it made them not fear death. So there are certain drugs, and this is why when people die in the civilized world, in hospitals, they're given morphine, and one of the effects is it makes you comfortable with death. You're not afraid. I find that music does the same thing. It can do the same thing. It can have the same effect. Now, what the physiological effect or the spiritual effect is, I'm not certain, but it will have the same effect on your body and your thinking and your feelings as a drug. So what in that passage, when he's talking about wanting to follow his parents, I think that what he's thinking about is what music does in coordinating your thinking and feeling puts you in a state of, in this case, fearlessness about death. In a way, it opens a window, and it gives you the truth of it. And the truth is not to be afraid.
I find myself sitting here with Mark Helprin. I don't know how it happened, but here he is. Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
I want to talk to you about your oeuvre, and I want to talk to you about 6 decades of writing, probably longer than 6 decades. Or I want to talk to you about your 6 decades of writing, but I want to talk to you in particular about the recurring themes in your fiction. It seems to me that, and you can help me articulate this, or I hope you will, that you're always writing about a few things, about love, about self-sacrifice, about the transcendent, about how music points us beyond itself to God, about how beauty points us beyond itself to God, or at least beyond itself to something. Can you add, or would you add to what I've just said? Because you write about these themes. What am I missing? I know I'm missing something as I'm trying to articulate it before we begin on the specifics.
Okay. First of all, thank you. And it's really, and I know it may sound trite, but it's an extraordinary honor. What you've just said, frankly, I don't see it, because I was trained not to accept praise, trained by my father, who was a very tough guy. You don't accept praise, you accept criticism and you work with it, but you dismiss praise. And that's what I've done all my life. I never believe it when people say really lovely things, such as you have said. So forgive me, but
Calling you a liar, Eric. I forgive
you're a
you.
liar.
I'm obliged to forgive you.
Okay, all right. But then going on to the substantive, may I have one little thing before it? You were talking about cuffs before. This is not on camera, but I knew a guy whose name was Frecky Vreeland. He was the son of Diana Vreeland, who was the Vogue woman, fashion editor for Vogue.
I remember that Diana Vreeland had a neglected son. One can only imagine how neglected Diana Vreeland's son was.
Well, he was neglected enough so that he became the CIA station chief in Rome during the Cold War. And he was a friend of mine at that time. And his nickname was Cuffs, because he was always very attentive.
Shooting his cuffs?
To his cuffs. And we called him Cuffs. Anyway, okay.
Now, wait a minute.
Yeah.
See, this is classic. Every time I try to have a conversation with you, you end up talking about something like that rather than answering the question. And frankly, I'm perfectly fine with that. I enjoy it. So since you've brought that up,
yeah.
I have to say that I saw the one-woman show, I think it was on Broadway, about the life of Diana Vreeland. And the line that I remember, she had met Hitler, or she knew of Hitler. She was in his circle at some point. And her line that I remember was how she talked about how the Nazi uniforms, it was all so beautifully designed. And then she says, but that mustache. She didn't approve of his Charlie Chaplin-esque mustache.
Yeah, well, there were worse things about him.
You think?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, but let's talk about the good things in your work. I mentioned those recurring themes in your work. I've read almost all of your books, I think all but one. I read Refiner's Fire, which came out in '77. I read, very early on, I read Winter's Tale and A Soldier of the Great War, and the books that have followed. And certainly in all of them, you touch on the things that I've just mentioned and related things. What could you, before we get into the specifics, would you be willing to help me articulate what it is that I was trying to articulate?
Yeah. Okay. Last night, there was a guest at the dinner, and he's a wonderful person. His name is Dan Searby, and he is a very devout Catholic. He came with Monsignor Charles in tow, and we were talking about music, which is what you want to talk about now. And it was really strange to me because this is a deeply religious man. I mean, it's his whole life. It consumes him. He's kind of
You're talking about the Monsignor?
No, Dan. Of course, the Monsignor too.
Yeah.
But Dan is that way.
Yes.
And yet he read Paris in the Present Tense, which is a lot about music.
Music.
Yes. And he didn't get it. He said, I tried to listen to Mozart, but I didn't get it. I didn't feel it. And which is extraordinary to me, because Mozart in particular is my favorite. It says, in fact, in Paris in the Present Tense, the protagonist, whose name is Jules Lacour.
I think you're mispronouncing it, but please continue.
Yes. He says to his students at the Sorbonne, he's a maître at the Sorbonne. He teaches cello. And he says, look, he says, I know this is not fashionable. It's not something that one can get away with in the university, even in France these days. But I'll tell you this, and I don't care how it's received, and I don't care what happens to me. But what it comes down to is music is the voice of God. And it's not fashionable in the university to say. So I was quite surprised.
It's extremely unfashionable.
Yeah, that Dan Searby, who was a profoundly religious man, didn't get that about Mozart, because I think it's inescapable in Mozart.
Well, actually, there are two issues here. One thing is to acknowledge it intellectually. Another is to experience it. And not everyone responds to the same things. In other words, there's some people for whom music is particularly transporting. There are other people for whom nature or natural beauty is particularly transporting. So I'm not surprised about that. But I had that marked in the book, the passage to which you just referred, about, how do we pronounce the protagonist's name?
Jules La Cour.
Yeah, that's not right. But Jules is a throwback. Many of your characters are that kind of a throwback. He's 74 years old in the book.
I didn't know that, but yeah, okay.
I think a number of your protagonists, I'm not kidding, are 74 years old. You seem to have picked that. But music is one of the things. I want to talk about that. But in other of your books, other things seem to point, Refiner's Fire, your first novel, in a few of your books, there's something similar at play, that these things seem to be signposts to God.
Yes, well, one of them is light.
Light.
Much concern, painters are obsessed with light. I mean, that's what they do because all color is part of the spectrum. And is there a message in light? Yes, of course there is, because there's a message in the way things are put together in nature. And if you think about these things, there's light, there's color, there's music. When we perceive what we have been given in creation, then those are all pointers that point to a lot of people get extremely moved when they look at the stars, or even depictions, telescopic depictions of the galaxies. I can't look at a picture of the galaxies from the space telescope, etc., and see all these hundreds of billions of stars and hundreds of billions of galaxies at such vast distances without a spiritual reaction to it. It's not just a thing. There's something that's so unbelievably deep and mysterious about it and wonderful that even just those pictures. I imagine, though, that there are a lot of people for whom these things don't penetrate.
Is it that, I think there are two issues. I think for some people, these things don't penetrate. I think there are other people who are predisposed. I shouldn't say that, no. There are other people who are bothered at these things penetrating, as you put it. They are hostile to it. So even if those things penetrate, if they get those stirrings, they say no. They reject it.
Well, that's partly because what you refer to as stirrings are not explicable by reason, which is a powerful tool, obviously, a magnificent tool, and a wonderful tool, but it's also a limited tool. And that's where you get the division. You have people who will not go beyond the precincts of reason, and they get frightened, actually. I find, I know a wonderful woman who is a more or less militant atheist, and I always say to her, why are you so evangelistic about atheism? What do you care about what I believe? And she can't answer that, of course, but she gets really disturbed, again, when you go beyond the precincts of reason, because, by the way, when you do, you don't have control, and you're out of control.
Also, what's interesting to me is to go beyond the precincts of reason or rationality is not to be irrational, but to go beyond them. In other words, it's not at war with rationality. It's simply beyond rationality. It's like talking about the material world. And if you talk about something that's beyond the material world, you're not talking about something that's anti-material.
That's correct. I mean, there's an institute in Washington called the Faith and Reason Institute. And it's very important that, and what you just said, I think, is very important, because those who would condemn a belief in a faith use reason as they juxtapose them. And I've always thought there's no contradiction. There's no contradiction whatsoever.
Actually, in fact, they are contradicting themselves. Just as you said, when somebody is trying to argue one into atheism, they're contradicting the very idea of atheism. In other words, if there is nothing beyond this world, then it's meaningless there is no meaning, even though they try to insist that there is such a thing as meaning apart from God. But the very idea that they would try to convince you is funny, because it simply doesn't make sense. If there is nothing beyond this world, then what does it matter what you believe? Yeah, I mean, you said that.
Yeah. Also, when they do that, when this very nice woman does that with me, I always find it, when you say funny, it is kind of amusing, because it's putting her in one of the accusations against religious people,
right.
among many, is that we are evangelistic.
Yeah.
And so I say to her, "Why are you so evangelistic?"
Right.
And of course that scrambles her brain.
Right.
But we're talking a great deal about theological things in which I am not qualified, except as a lowly human being.
It's only because you're not qualified that I want to discuss them with you.
Oh,
the people
yeah,
who
I
are
knew it.
qualified are they get very bogged down. I think the best theologians are not theologians. That's a quote. I want to read a passage from your extraordinary book, Paris in the Present Tense. This came out, 2010-ish? Something
17, I think.
Oh, that recent, 2017.
Yeah.
Paris in the Present Tense. Because it refers exactly to what we were just now discussing. This is about Jules. Is it Jules?
Jules.
Jules. You're pronouncing it with a slight Cockney accent. Are you aware of that?
In my view,
Yeah.
it's not a Cockney accent. It's more like Michael Caine.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Right. Who throws his sentences away at the end.
Oh, that's good.
Like that. Now, that's not
His
exactly
sentences
Cockney,
away.
but it's almost that way.
Yeah. And
In my view.
when we're done here, I'm going to sing "I've Got a Lovely Bunch of Coconuts," made famous by Merv Griffin. Did you know that?
Did not.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so here's the passage from page 242 of this glorious book, Paris in the Present Tense. The title of the chapter is The Music Lesson, and it refers to Jules. It says, "He did live, although all his life he wanted to follow his mother and father." Now, we should say they're murdered by the SS.
Mm-hmm. And let me just interrupt you there for a second.
You're not interrupting. Go ahead.
I have known two people, one of whom was a Hungarian whom I met in Israel, who became seriously schizophrenic. He moved to Canada and he was in terrible trouble. He may be on the street now, I don't know, but he's gone. When he was 5 years old, he watched his mother and father executed by a bullet in the head, both of them, when he was 5 years old. Of course, that was
by the Nazis in Hungary.
Yes. And then the person after whom Jules Lacour is named, and in honor of whom, was someone that I knew all my life, and he lost both his parents also in the Holocaust, and saw them murdered in front of him. So this has his name was Julian Licht, and he's mentioned the book is dedicated to him. So these are people that I knew who did experience that, and Jules Lacour in the book saw the same thing. As a child, watched his parents executed in front of him.
So Jules Lacour, he's at the end of his life. He's in his 70s, and this chapter says he did live, although all his life he wanted to follow his mother and father into realms of which he had no fear, if only because they were there, and by sharing in their defeat, to know, honor, and love them well. He lived intensely and deeply even so. Music kept him steady on course. Its magic clarified existence, stimulated courage as if from thin air, and illuminated that which could not be understood except in the language of music itself, and of which, when the music ceased, the only remnants were the conviction and desire such as one has when longing to re-enter a dream. This reminds me of what you shared about your own biography of being cognizant as an infant of having left something like eternity to enter this world and of not fearing re-entering it on the other side of life. It sounds like you're talking about...
That was a long time ago that I said that to you, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But
you remembered it.
I mean, I remembered it, but I also... we may have talked about it when we were together at your home a couple of months ago, but that strikes me as very similar to what we're talking about here, and as at the center of the theme we're articulating about your work, and how music in this passage is a pointer, is a signpost to the world beyond this world. So to talk about that, because also tell us about who is Jules Lecoeur.
Well, in a way, when music is, you say signpost, but in a way it's also kind of like a drug, a very powerful drug, a narcotic. For instance, if those of you who have been have had surgery, and they give you this very powerful, I guess I actually had surgery. I had a partial thyroidectomy, and they gave me fentanyl before then, and it puts you in another world. Even with N2O, if you go to the dentist and they give you N2O, it does something to you. As far as I'm concerned, when I've had that, well, what it has done is it enables me to look at death fearlessly. And this is, the assassins were, these were people who, there's when the Mongols invaded the Middle East, they conquered everything up to the Battle of Ain Jalut, where the Mamluks managed to throw them back.
Gesundheit.
Yeah. Well, wait a minute. So they were also resisted deeper in toward Central Asia by people who were called the assassins, and their leader was named Rukn ad-Din, and they lived in high fortresses, and the Mongols couldn't get to the fortresses, and they would send people out to kill the Mongol leaders. And before they sent them out, they would partake of hashish, so that they weren't afraid of death. And this happens a lot. In fact, unfortunately, when in October 7th, when Hamas came and slaughtered the Israelis, they were under the influence of Captagon, and it made them not fear death. So there are certain drugs, and this is why when people die in the civilized world, in hospitals, they're given morphine, and one of the effects is it makes you comfortable with death. You're not afraid. I find that music does the same thing. It can do the same thing. You can have the same effect. Now, what the physiological effect or the spiritual effect is, I'm not certain, but it will have the same effect on your body and your thinking and your feelings as a drug. So what in that passage, when he's talking about wanting to follow his parents, I think that what he's thinking about is what music does in coordinating your thinking and feeling, puts you in a state of, in this case, fearlessness about death. In a way, it opens a window, and it gives you the truth of it. And the truth is not to be afraid.
That's different than a drug, I have to say. Taking hashish before I kill people to give me false courage is different from the genuine courage, which I think music gives one.
Well, there are similarities in that when you do have that drug, it has some of the similar effects. It makes you. I mean, literally, when I had the fentanyl before I had surgery, I felt the same sort of thing that I feel when I'm listening to Mozart, for example, to the best parts of Mozart, which do that. They transport you to a different realm in which you're not afraid.
So it's not all music, but some music.
Yes, well, it's certainly not all music. I mean, listen, if you go to the opera and you sit there, there's three-quarters of opera is essentially nothing. It's just the arias, which are really beautiful and transportive. But all that talking and back and forth and everything, that's the 19th century streaming stuff, to keep you occupied. The plot of the opera. It's the arias that count. And even in Mozart, I have to select certain things which are just as. There was a guy in New York. His name was de Koven. You ever hear of de Koven? He had a radio show in New York in the 50s and the 60s, and he was high voltage gay, and that was unusual for the time for him to be on the radio.
High voltage
gay, and he was so passionate about music, and he would have certain pieces of music that he would call OTW, which was out of this world, or super OTW, or he would say super, super, super OTW. So he also had the classification system of the music that would be absolutely ineffable and transport you. And I do the same thing, although I don't do it in high voltage gay, but I do it, I have
You choose not to.
I choose not to, yes.
Yeah.
Certain pieces of music that are just, as de Koven might have said, super, super OTW.
Yeah.
Because not all, I mean, it's just like, if, for instance, if you, in that book, that was a pretty nice passage, if I do say so myself. I'm kind of surprised by it. But not every passage in the book is like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad writing in here,
yeah.
just to be clear. A lot of trash, but you wade through that to passages like this. You, a couple of paragraphs later, you say that, well, he was a musician. He taught music. I don't remember. He taught cello?
Cello, yes.
Cello. He says, it made a quiet existence better than that which was royal or rich. Every step and misstep brought him closer to them, that's his parents who have been killed, and made him loyal to all who had come before. Though it never succeeded completely, music promised that sin and suffering might be washed away. That's inescapably theological and beautiful. This protagonist, like most of your protagonists, there's an extreme dignity. It's not about money. It's not about flash. It's about serving something and being content and more than content to serve that something. In this case, music. But that line, music promised that sin and suffering might be washed away. Can you say more about that? That's heavy.
It's just what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
If you're transported to a higher level, then you are literally on a higher level, and you look down, and you see that the things of the world are what they are, which is limited, and there's a much higher and better world, a spiritual world. I don't mean I'm not talking about heaven in the medieval Muslim or Christian idea of heaven. They're just sitting on a cloud and you have a lot of grapefruit. And
I think that's the New Yorker cartoon version of heaven.
Yes, that's the New Yorker. Yeah, I'm talking about
Dante's version of heaven.
You can't even. Well, Dante's version, when you get to it, it's like those lights. And by the way, you can't see from the cameras, but we're staring at lights. He can't even look at God because it's too bright at the very end in Paradiso, and it's not definable. It's not something that we can say, oh well, it's this or that or whatever. But we can sense it. We can sense that there's something and also you get the feeling that at that point, wherever it is, and I'm getting vague here because it is vague, that everything is forgiven. Everything is forgiven, and you look back with love and tranquility, at the past, at life in the world.
How can everything, the idea that everything is forgiven somehow automatically, how does that square with your idea of justice? Because you deal with justice in many of your books. I think you said that your book Winter's Tale is about justice. How can there be justice if everything is forgiven?
Okay, I'll tell you how. In fact, in Winter's Tale, there's a whole section about that in which Peter Lake has a conversation with Isaac Penn, who is Beverly Penn's father, about this very, very thing. Now, I don't remember it exactly, but I remember the gist of it and how I got to it. And this is how I got to it. When I was in the Israeli army, I went to the intake base, which was called Bakum, which is in Tel Aviv. And there they shave your head and they look at your teeth in case you're burned beyond recognition so they can identify the body. And they give you all kinds of shots and they literally throw your uniform at you. The guy behind the counter looks at you and he sizes you up, and he literally sizes you. And then he pulls it and he throws it at you and you catch it and that's your uniform, and it never fit. And it was also it was used from other people. I mean, it's not like the American Army. They're a lot rougher. But anyway, I got on the wrong bus to go to the training camp. And I got on the bus that was for a prison camp.
What year is this?
This was 1972. It was October 22nd, 1972. And by the way, that's the anniversary, October 22nd, of when I met my wife.
In 78.
In 78, exactly 6 years later. But anyway, October 22nd, 1972, I'm on this bus with a bunch of prisoners. There's one murderer. There's no capital punishment in it. So there's one murderer, a lot of rapists, drug dealers, thieves, rougher-uppers, muggers, whatever.
How'd you get on this bus, Mark?
By mistake. My Hebrew
I know.
Yeah. My Hebrew wasn't the greatest then because I was quite early. So I'm on this bus, and we're going up to a training camp in the West Bank called Bet Arba, which B4, and it's an infamous camp where they in this case it's training camp in general, but we were in a group which was supposed to be ground down so that we could serve in the army. It was an experiment, and I got in it wrongly, and you can't get out of it. If you're in a prison situation, you can't walk up to the guard and say, "Listen, I shouldn't be here," which is what I did.
You actually got onto a bus.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
And when we got there, I realized I knew beforehand that we were in the wrong place. I was in the wrong place. And when we got there, we were put out in the field. It was freezing cold, and we had to stand at attention, and they were yelling at us and screaming at us because we were to be mistreated, to be ground down.
Because you were assumed to be a hardened criminal.
That's right. And I went through this process, but that's a whole other story. But what I want to say is that, and by the way, I did walk up to the officer who was screaming at us, and I said, "Excuse me, I shouldn't really be here." And if you do that when you're in prison, they don't pay much attention. But anyway, so on the way up, the murderer, whose name was Ashkenazi, which means a European Jew, a German type of Jew, which is what I am. I'm 98% Ashkenazi from 23andMe. I found that out. His name was Ashkenazi, but he was actually a Sephardi. He was an Asian Jew, a Middle Eastern Jew, but his name was Ashkenazi. How he got that name, I don't know. We stopped at a kind of a refreshment stand on the road up to the camp.
Man, if you're going to kill somebody, I think Israel is the place to do it.
Yeah, well, there's no capital punishment except for Adolf Eichmann.
You get to go to a refreshment stand on the way to serving in the army.
Well, but it's nothing like Sweden. I mean, look at what was the Norway? Anders Breivik, who killed 70 people, slaughtered 70 people.
Yeah.
And he has a suite with books and televisions, and he is getting different college degrees.
But that's only for a few years. Then he goes to hell.
Eventually, yeah. But wait, let me finish this.
Yeah.
So So this Ashkenazi murderer, there was a monkey in the cage at this refreshment stand. For tourists like to look at monkeys, right? And
Yes, tourists like to look at monkeys. Whatever you say, Mark, please continue.
Okay, so Ashkenazi goes into the bushes a little bit, and he pulls a stick out of the bushes, and somehow he got a knife. He's a murderer with a knife, and we later had machine guns, and hand grenades and rockets, and he sharpens the end of the stick.
Are there no guards?
There was, but there were two at least on the bus.
So they're not watching the murderer very carefully?
No, they're not watching anything very carefully. Sharpens the end of the stick, and uses it to push in the monkey cage and kills the monkey.
So he murders the monkey.
He murders the monkey.
He can't murder an animal, but he kills the monkey.
He kills the monkey in front of everybody. And I was really horrified by this. And I said, what is going on? Where am I?
Maybe that monkey needed killing. You ever think about that?
No, it was a nice monkey.
It was not a murderous monkey?
It was a very nice monkey. I mean, I don't
believe.
Yeah.
What were we talking about? Please continue.
Hold on.
I'm sure it's important.
It will come back to the...
Yeah.
It's an oxbow, it comes
Okay,
back.
all right.
So he killed the monkey. Now, I said to myself, I got to keep away from this guy. He's a murderer. He killed a monkey, and he was really beyond he was crazy.
So he didn't kill the monkey to eat the monkey?
No, the monkey was in a cage.
He just had a thing against monkeys?
He was a murderer. He was a monkey murderer. All right. So, okay, here's the thing. Later on in Refiner's Fire, and
which you wrote in 1977, 5 years after this experience.
That's correct. He saves the life of a bunch of soldiers.
You mean you made this man whom you'd met, this murderer,
yes.
You put him in your book, Refiner's Fire.
Right.
And in the book?
He saves the life of, and it's in the book that he kills the monkey, but then he saves the life of these soldiers. So yes, he's a vicious murderer who killed someone and killed a monkey, but there is utility in him. He has saved the lives of 5 people. So one might say that's God's plan. And we don't know exactly how it works. They say God works in mysterious ways. And in
his wonders to perform.
Yes. In Winter's Tale, in the discussion, what Peter Lake says to Isaac Penn, or maybe Isaac Penn says it to Peter Lake, I don't.
This is in the novel following Refiner's Fire.
Yes. What he says is that justice is something sometimes comes from the past, unbeknownst to us, and it surfaces. So we can't always tell. As Hamlet says, and our indiscretions sometimes serve us well, for there is a divinity that shapes our ends. Our ends not meaning our tukuses, but our fate.
Right.
So if indiscretions can serve us well, and they do sometimes, then also possibly even injustices can. Things that are terrible.
Can, but don't necessarily.
Not necessarily, no.
So, so it's difficult to, you seem to be making the case that everyone is forgiven.
Well, when I say all is forgiven, I don't really mean that exactly literally. No, I don't think Hitler would be forgiven. But who knows? Maybe even in God's time and God's grace, maybe even Hitler would be forgiven.
Right.
Maybe if you look, what Winter's Tale starts with looking down from the clouds, beyond the clouds, at the city in the late 19th century, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century.
New York City.
New York City. And it's silent. And you're looking at the past. The past is frozen, as in photographs of the past. And if you look at that way, and I looked when I wrote that book, I was immersed in the history of New York, of the city of New York. And when you look at photographs of people in the 19th century, particularly because we didn't have photographs before the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century photographs, they have a look which they are frozen forever. And there's something about that the way that they look at the camera, they look at you. I don't know. It gives me a feeling of immense benevolence and love for those people who are no longer here. And I think there's something that it's as if they're reaching out beyond time, into this time, and there's a message in their eyes. And so maybe even for people who were, and for instance, Peter Leicht was a criminal. There was something about him that was worthy of love, a great deal that was worthy of love. I don't know. I think I'm going in a place where I don't know quite where I am.
What we're talking about is this world and how there are things in this world that point beyond this world. Let's put it that way. We're talking about being in the present and having things in the present pointing beyond time, beyond the past, beyond the future, into eternity. At least that's how I see it. And there's a passage in the book, Paris in the Present Tense, about time. And of course, Paris in the present tense makes us think about time. And I want to ask you about that if we have the time. But you say in the chapter entitled DNA, just as a curve is a series of infinitely small angles, and according to philosophers, a point cannot exist, logically there is no present, but only the infinitesimal and perhaps non-existent space between past and future, as any schoolchild thinking about space and time might suspect. One thing that distinguishes Paris, however, making of it a magnet of attraction, is that it turns all this on its head. In Paris, the present dominates the spectrum of time, spreading the otherwise invisible gap between past and future into spacious fields, the ends of which one cannot even see. Just as music sounded out is only either heard in time that is past or will be heard in time yet to come, and yet is solely of the present, Paris is overwhelmingly of the present as well. I don't understand that. I don't disagree with it, but it doesn't seem obvious to me. Why is the book titled Paris in the present tense?
Several reasons. One, when I started writing it, I thought that I would, for the first time in my life, write a book that actually is in the present tense. People do that. There are books like that, and they go like this. They say, I walk to the store, I see John, I say to him, let me tell you about my experience, and it's actually done in the present tense, and there is a kind of a magnetism to it. It's somewhat interesting, and I thought, well, I'll do that too, and then I didn't, but I liked the title, see, and I also liked it because of what you just read, because I do feel that about Paris, that it has the power and the quality of making you live very much in the present, as opposed to the first part of that passage introduced you to thinking about the past or anticipating the future. When you do live in the present, that's a wonderful thing. That's what people say. That's what, when they really enjoy themselves, what they're doing is living in the present. And that what people also will say, I feel it's authentic. It's real life. It's something that's worthwhile. That's living in the present. And Paris, for me anyway, has that power. I lived there as a child for a year.
Did your parents know about this?
About that when I lived in Paris?
Yeah.
No.
You just snuck away.
Yeah,
and lived there.
I was 4.
So you were 4.
Yeah.
So your parents lived in Paris.
Yes.
Why were you in Paris?
I was in Paris because my father was his company was called London Films, and he was the president of the company. But the company really was run, etc., by Alex Korda, Sir Alexander Korda,
Who was Churchill's
friend and benefactor. Yeah, and so my father came on. My father started with working for Charlie Chaplin when he was a little boy in 1912.
When your father was a little boy.
When my father was a little boy. I think it's an interesting story. Shall I tell it?
Your father worked for Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah, my father.
I don't think he could fail to be interesting.
Yeah.
So, how did your father come to meet and work with Charlie Chaplin?
Well, when my father's my grandmother was diagnosed with consumption at the beginning of, my father was born in 1904, and in the aughts she was diagnosed with consumption. So my grandfather took her and his family to Los Angeles because the climate was dry and better, and people did that then. That you went to a dry climate like Arizona, although that was a territory at the time, and I think it was territory. And a lot of it, Oklahoma was territory. Anyway, they took a train to Los Angeles, and that's where they lived. And my father went to a school which was only had mainly Mexicans in it, Spanish speaking, and that's why he spoke fluent Spanish. And he would go to school barefoot because that's what first he had shoes, but they all were barefoot. So he said, I can't do that because I'd stick out. So he went barefoot. But behind his house there was a hill, and up on the hill there was a wall, and on the wall it said Essanay, Essanay. And when he was a kid, he always looked at the wall and said, "What is that? What is that wall?" It says Essanay, Essanay. And he was about 8 years old. I don't know the exact numbers, ages, years. And he said one day he climbed up the hill, and he climbed over the wall, and he jumped down, and he was caught by a man who was sort of like Ben Turpin, if anyone knows who Ben Turpin was.
Ben Turpin?
Yes. He had garter sleeves and a mustache.
Ben Turpin?
Yeah.
I'm picturing Ben Turpin.
An early movie actor. He looked
very early.
He had a mustache.
He had sort of slightly screwy eyes.
Yeah. Okay. So he's caught by a guy who looked kind of like Ben Turpin, and he said,
what are you in their reference? So why even mention it? Go ahead.
What are you doing here? And my father said, I live down there. And so he took him to see the boss. There are Quonset huts behind this wall. And the boss said to him, you live around here? Because Ben Turpin, or whoever it was, said, yeah, he lives around here. And the boss said, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'll give you a penny for every kid that you bring here next Saturday at 10 o'clock. So my father said, okay. A penny was a lot then.
1912.
Yeah, 12 or 8, whatever it was, in the early part of the... And he said, okay. It wasn't 1912 because in 1912 I think they were back. But anyway, whenever it was.
Well, you said he was around 8 and he was born in 1904.
Yeah, but I don't know if he was 8. He might have been younger.
Oh.
Anyway, he brought these kids, and they put all the kids in a Quonset hut, seated them down, and then the boss said, okay, I want you to see this and then tell me what you think. And they showed a very early film. And the kids looked at the film, and then after the film, the boss said to them, what did you think? This was the first focus group. And the boss was Charlie Chaplin. Yeah. Now, later...
Now relate this back to whatever it was we were talking about.
Who knows what we were talking about? Later, my father went to... He was as I mentioned...
This is how you came to live in Paris.
Yeah, okay.
In Paris.
All right. So he then became, as I mentioned last night, he was one of the 2 film critics on the New York Times.
Wait a minute. Your father's a little kid.
Yeah.
He meets Charlie Chaplin. What happens then?
Nothing. After that was the first instance when he met Charlie Chaplin.
But he didn't work for Charlie Chaplin?
Well, he worked by being the focus group guy.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I see.
But
he was bitten by the bug, the showbiz bug.
Well, he was, actually, and that's a whole other story which we don't have time to tell.
Yeah.
But he became one of the 2 film critics for the New York Times and the theatrical editor of the New York Times. And then he was taken into United Artists, which was founded by Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks Jr.
And Charlie Chaplin.
Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin and Alex Korda. And my father was taken from the Times into that. He became the director of publicity. So now he really was working directly for Charlie Chaplin. Okay? And then Alex Korda was the one who was president of London Films, and he went from United Artists. He also went through Goldwyn. He was the head of studios for Fox, etc. But then he joined Alex Korda at London Films, and so he was in Europe a lot, and so it was advantageous for us to live in Paris for a year. That's why.
And this was in the early 50s.
51. Yeah. And
And you remember that even though you were so young.
I was 4. I remember it exactly. Extremely well.
You've said that your father had a genuinely photographic memory,
Yeah, he
which
did.
is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah.
You clearly have inherited some of that. I mean, if you don't mind my stating that, anybody who's read your work knows that you're not normal.
I'm not normal. No, I'm not normal, that's for sure.
Yeah, and who's to say what's normal? Well, so we were talking about Paris in the present tense, and you were saying that there's something about Paris.
Yes, there's something.
I mean, I think it's an utterly subjective statement to make, but I wouldn't disagree with it. It's just interesting to me that you feel that so strongly.
Well, you know what the omphalos was, right?
Yes.
Okay. For me, the omphalos, and it's probably because I lived there when I was 4 and entered certain
That's the
stages.
title of one of the chapters in my book, which you've read, Omphalos.
Yes, it's also the title, I think, in the chapter of Moby Dick, which you've read.
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, I think so.
How nice that that we've each written books that refer somehow to Moby Dick.
Yeah, but I mean, the in Delphi, that's the center of the Greek universe. Is Delphi. For me, probably because of the stage of development that I was in at 4, and because I lived there, Paris is the center of the universe.
Yeah.
For me, even though I'm not French, to say the least.
Right.
And
you can't even pronounce Jules Lecoeur.
You can. I can. Yeah.
Well, so you write about time, but when you're writing about time, you're really writing about eternity, or you're pointing to eternity. When you're writing about music, you're talking about how it points beyond itself to eternity. When you write about beauty, when you write about love, these are the themes that you never really avoid. They seem to be either at the center or near the center of everything you've written. And you've written how many novels? 10?
No, I don't know.
Close. Close enough. Refiner's Fire, Winter's Tale,
Winter's
Souls of
Tale,
the Great War,
Souls of the Great War, and Proof Case,
Freddie and Frederica, Sunlight Shadow,
Paris and the Present Princess, Ocean's 8 anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe there's another one, I don't know.
Well, and plenty short stories.
Yeah.
But
so it must be more, because I think I have a total of 14 or 15 books, so it must be somewhere in there. But, you forget them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've written another book that hasn't been published yet. Shh, don't tell anybody the title. In your book that we discussed last night, The Oceans and the Stars, blue seems to me to be particularly prominent. I mentioned this to you when we were together at your home. Color, the color of the sky, your descriptions in many cases of the sky partake of what we're discussing. I mean, in the case of the sky, it literally is something that pulls us beyond this world. But even the color blue, even colors have the power to do that. That's interesting to me.
Yes. I'll tell you something.
Although mauve never does.
No, mauve, well, we know about that, don't we?
I don't know.
Last night, yeah. Last night there was a photographer, and she...
Oh, actually, I wasn't thinking of that. You don't need to bring this up, but thank you. No. But blue. But blue, cerulean blue. What is it, do you think? Obviously, you're speculating if you have a thought on it, but what do you think it might be about the blue color of the sky that pulls us beyond this world?
This is really amazing to me because, and I can't go into it too much because I never do with a book that hasn't been published yet.
Yes.
But that's my last book is the book that I've just written, my last novel. And it's all about that. And the last word in it is blue. And I won't tell you the sentence, but I believe it's very powerful. The title has that in it, and the very last word is blue. It's strange, because this is what I found. When I was young, color meant much more to me, the visual meant. And as I've gotten older, sound has become more influential, and I appreciate it more than the visual. So there was a kind of a movement from one thing to another, and I imagine that a lot of people may be like that. I don't know. It certainly happened with me. But then color and light were just about everything. In Refiner's Fire, for example, in our early books, there's very little mention of sound. Not much music in it, and later sound comes in. I appreciate it more as I go deaf, by the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of mention. It's been many years since I've read Refiner's Fire, but of fire and color, and light. You've experienced the transcendent in your life a few times. When you talk about remembering before you were born, whatever that means. Have you had any mystical experiences?
Yeah, lots.
Lots.
Yeah, especially on the subway. Yeah, but I got to say something before. You mentioned about the light and everything. When I was a freshman, I had to take a course called Home 2. They abbreviate things in college because they use abbreviations because it's the jargon that shows you're the in person. It was called Humanities 2. It's a required course. I don't think they have that anymore because, Harvard has just become a nightmare place. But in this course, we read in English Dante. Later I read Dante with Professor Dante della Terza in Italian, which was the way you should read it if you can. But this was in English. We read it, and I wrote a paper. And the paper was accompanied by a graph. And the paper was Dante's use of light in the Divine Comedy. And using a concordance, I graphed in each canto from Inferno all the way through to the end, the appearance of the words luce, lume, or any word related to light. And the graph, don't forget, he starts in hell and he ascends to heaven. It goes like this. It was astounding. And I gave it to the section man, which is, I guess most people call it teaching fellow.
Teaching assistant.
Teaching assistant, whatever.
Graduate student.
Graduate student, oppressed graduate student. Punk, yes. And he called me in and he said, listen, are you in the sciences? And I said, no. And he said, I've never gotten a literary paper that has a graph in it. And I said, but it's a legitimate point, isn't it? And he said, it is, but this is not how we write literary criticism. And of course, he was right. But
no, he wasn't.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, you don't have to have a graph. But isn't that interesting that
it's more than interesting. It's amazing.
Goes
because
like that.
It brings up at least one question. Was Dante consciously aware of this?
I don't know. I think not. I think because I'll tell you why. You can't write something like that without thoroughly surrendering to your subconscious and all its powers. It's like walking. When you walk, you don't think, well, I'm going to put this foot there, I'm going to put that foot there. Or let's say a great tennis player, he's not thinking, oh, I'll go over here, I'll lift my arm like this.
You have to wonder, though, Mark. I mean, there are various kinds of genius. C.S. Lewis, in his Narnia books, there's 7 of them, he does some things that were not revealed until like 10 years ago, that he had, there's an extraordinary book, there are 2 actually, one is called Planet Narnia, and I can't remember what the other one is, but by the same author, Michael Ward. I've interviewed him at a Socrates in the City maybe 10 years ago, but Lewis, who is this genius, in the course of those 7 books, in each one, he has extremely cleverly and subtly, but nonetheless consciously and intentionally put in things that refer to each of the 7 medieval planets. So each book has this kind of as a background, and most people, everyone except Michael Ward, would not notice it, but somehow he noticed it. And then you wonder with a genius like Dante, whether he might have been aware of that.
Okay,
I don't know.
I have an answer for that, and that's this. You know, I've written a lot of speeches for politicians, which, by the way, I advise anyone who's thinking about a career, don't do that.
Yeah.
Okay? And I mean, I think I've had maybe 5 or 6 at least presidential candidates that I've written speeches for, and acceptance speeches, and this, that, and the other thing. And one thing that I found is that universally, no matter who they are, although there's some exceptions, the politicians don't understand when substance and style run together. They don't understand that at all. What they think is that a speechwriter is someone who prettifies an idea. But that's not so. It has to be a combination of substance and style so that they are ineffably mixed, and you can't tell the difference between the two. And any Churchill speech is like that.
We're talking about good speeches.
Good speeches, yes. Not the garbage that you hear most of the time, the totally unmemorable garbage. But when you have a speech which is a great speech, inspiring and somehow transcendent, it's because the substance and the style are indistinguishable. One contributes to the other, and that's what you're talking about, is when you have when they run together. And putting them together, you might have a notion. C.S. Lewis might have had the notion, well, I'll do this with the planets, but then it just comes.
Yes.
It comes like it's fluid.
Yeah.
And it happens almost automatically.
I'm dismayed to say that we're out of time. So I don't think we've exactly put a bow on this conversation. I'd like to have another conversation with you on other subjects, which we'll do after this. But I think it'll be impossible not to circle back to some of the things we've been discussing, which makes me feel better. Thank you, Mark Helprin.
You're very welcome. It's an honor.